For 500 years, they called it the oldest city in North America. Long before there was a Boston or a Montreal or a Quebec, there was a harbor, hidden behind a wall of cliffs on the easternmost edge of the continent, and ships were already sailing to it, season after season, to take the richest fish in the ocean. For centuries, that harbor built one of the great trading economies of the Atlantic world, a place so central to the wealth of an empire that it eventually governed itself as its own country, with its own money and its own flag. And then, in the space of a single afternoon, a fire burned nearly all of it to the ground. And a century later, the one thing that had built the city in the first place, the fish itself, simply vanished from the ocean, and this time, it did not come back. This is the story of St. John's, Newfoundland, the oldest city on the continent, and the two disasters, one sudden and one slow, that came within 100 years of each other and nearly finished what 500 years had built. But before we go any further, I have a small favor to ask. We work incredibly hard to dig up these forgotten chapters of history and rebuild them piece by piece. The places, the fortunes, and the disasters that time tried to erase. But looking at our analytics, the vast majority of you watching right now are not subscribed. It costs you nothing, and it takes about 2 seconds. But it makes an enormous difference in keeping this channel alive and growing, so we can keep bringing these stories back from the dead. So if you want to see more of the history the world left behind, take a second and hit that subscribe button right now. Thank you. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to a harbor behind a wall of rock and the fish that made it worth finding. Everything about St. John's begins with a piece of geography, so useful it decided the fate of the place before a single building stood on it. The harbor sits behind a narrow gap in a line of high, steep cliffs, a passage so tight that a ship approaching from the open Atlantic can be almost on top of it before the opening becomes visible at all. Once through that gap, called simply the Narrows, the sea disappears behind you, and you are inside a deep, round, almost perfectly sheltered basin, protected from the storms of the North Atlantic by solid rock on every side. It is one of the finest natural harbors anywhere on the eastern seaboard of the continent, and it sits directly beside one of the richest fishing grounds on the planet, the shallow underwater plateau known as the Grand Banks, where cold and warm currents meet and feed one of the greatest concentrations of cod ever recorded on Earth. This is the single fact from which the rest of the story descends. Not ambition, not a grand plan, not the accident of a pretty coastline. Geography. A sheltered harbor, sitting directly beside an inexhaustible supply of the most valuable fish in the European diet, at the exact point where ships crossing the Atlantic first make landfall. Salted and dried, cod could be preserved for years and shipped anywhere, and it fed the laboring poor and the fasting faithful of Catholic Europe on a scale almost nothing else could match. Whoever controlled access to that fishery controlled access to a fortune, and this was the harbor that controlled it. European fishing fleets were almost certainly working these waters within years of the ocean crossing that made the New World known to Europe at all. The English explorer John Cabot sailed these waters at the very end of the 15th century, and the reports that came back described a sea so thick with cod that a weighted basket lowered over the side could be hauled back up full. Word like that does not stay quiet for long. Within a generation, ships from the west of England, from Portugal, from the Basque Country, and from France were crossing the ocean every summer to fish these waters, and the harbor behind the Narrows became their gathering place, a natural, sheltered stop where crews could put in, take on water, dry their catch on the surrounding hillsides, and make repairs before the long voyage home. For decades, this was a seasonal fishery and nothing more. Ships came in the spring and left in the autumn, and no one lived here through the winter by design. The system that grew up around that seasonal fishery was, in its own way, remarkably sophisticated for its time. Crews crossing from the west of England would arrive each spring, take up the same stretches of shoreline their fathers and grandfathers had used before them, known as fishing rooms, and spend the summer catching, splitting, salting, and drying cod on wooden platforms built out over the rocks. The Basque and Portuguese and French fleets working the same waters had their own arrangements, their own harbors and drying grounds along the coast, and for the better part of a century, the whole business ran as an enormous, informal, transatlantic operation, with no permanent government at all, just custom, habit, and the simple fact that whoever controlled the best drying ground each season generally kept it the season after. St. John's Harbor, sheltered and close to the richest grounds, became the most contested and most valuable of all these seasonal stations, the place every captain wanted to reach first when the ice broke each spring. And then, in the summer of 1583, an Englishman sailed into the harbor and changed its legal status forever. Enter Sir Humphrey Gilbert, an English soldier and adventurer who arrived at St. John's Harbor with a royal commission to claim new lands for the English crown. Standing on the shore among the fishing crews already working the harbor, he formally took possession of Newfoundland in the name of Queen Elizabeth I, making it, on paper, the first English colony anywhere in the New World. Gilbert himself would not live to see what came of it. Sailing home that autumn in a small ship, he was lost, with all hands, in a storm on the open Atlantic, reportedly calling out to his companion vessel that they were as near heaven by sea as by land. The colony he claimed on paper took much longer to become a colony, in fact, but the claim itself mattered. St. John's Harbor was now, by English law, the oldest English settlement in the Americas. For a long time afterward, that legal claim sat uneasily alongside the reality on the water. The powerful fishing merchants back in England did not actually want permanent settlement here. A colony meant competition, local fishermen working the grounds year-round instead of English crews sailing out each spring. And, for more than a century, those merchant interests used their influence in London to discourage, and at times actively suppress, permanent settlement in Newfoundland. People settled anyway. Fishing families, servants who chose to stay rather than sail home. The hardy and the stubborn built houses on the hillsides above the harbor, despite the official discouragement, season after season, generation after generation, until the fact of the settlement simply outlasted the policy meant to prevent it. By the time anyone in London seriously tried to stop it, there was already a town here too established to remove. What kept that town alive, and eventually made it rich, was the simple, brutal economics of salt cod. Through the 1700s and into the 1800s, European wars disrupted rival fishing fleets and drove prices for preserved fish higher and higher. And the merchants of St. John's, sitting on the best harbor, closest to the richest grounds, captured an outsized share of the profit. Whole hillsides around the harbor turned into a single vast, informal factory for processing fish. Wooden platforms called flakes, covering acre after acre. Cod laid out to dry in the wind and sun before being packed into barrels and loaded onto ships bound for Spain, Portugal, Brazil, and the Caribbean. The town grew up crowded and chaotic around the working harbor, its economy built entirely on a single resource pulled from the sea a few miles offshore, and the men who controlled the buying, salting, and shipping of that resource became some of the wealthiest merchants in the British Empire. The system those merchants built to control the trade was as important as the fish itself, and it shaped the whole colony for generations. Because most fishing families along the coast had no cash and no bank to turn to, the St. John's merchant houses extended credit each spring, advancing salt, gear, and provisions against the promise of the autumn catch, and settling accounts at the season's end in fish rather than money. It was called the truck system, and it bound entire outport communities, families who lived in tiny coastal settlements, scattered across hundreds of miles of shoreline, directly to the ledgers of a handful of firms on Water Street. A bad season meant a family fell further into debt they could never quite clear. A good season meant the merchant, who set both the price of the gear he advanced and the price he paid for the fish he received, took his share, coming and going. It was not always fair, and there was real resentment in it, but it was also the only system the colony had, and it made St. John's not merely a port, but the financial center of an entire scattered population, up and down a coastline, with almost no roads to connect it any other way. Picture Water Street, the long commercial spine of the town. On a busy afternoon, in the final decades of the 19th century, the harbor below is a forest of masts, schooners, and brigs, riding at anchor 3 and 4 deep, small boats ferrying crews and cargo between the ships and the wharves. Along the street itself run the great stone and brick premises of the fish merchants, warehouses stacked floor to ceiling with barrels of salt cod bound for the ports of southern Europe, counting houses where clerks total the season's catch against the credit extended to hundreds of outport fishing families up and down the coast. The merchant houses that dominate this street, firms with names that have become institutions in their own right, sit at the absolute center of the colony's economy, controlling the supply chain from the fishing boat to the foreign buyer, and extending credit that binds entire coastal communities to their ledgers. It is loud, and it smells of salt and fish and tar, and it is, by any measure of the era, one of the more remarkable commercial districts anywhere on the North Atlantic Rim, built entirely on the strength of a fish that most of the people who ate it would never see caught. Above the harbor, the hillsides climb steeply toward the surrounding cliffs, packed with the small wooden homes of fishing families and laborers, chimney smoke hanging low over closely built streets that switch back and forth up the slope. The air carries the sharp, unmistakable smell of drying fish from the flakes still working along the shoreline, mixed with tar and coal smoke and the salt of the harbor itself. Horse carts labor up the steep grades, hauling barrels and gear between the wharves and the stores above, and on a clear afternoon, the whole hillside seems to hum with the business of a working port at the height of its trade. Down at the water's edge, the merchant princes of Water Street conduct business from offices with harbor views, watching their own ships come and go, the way the railway barons of a larger city might watch their own trains. Because in St. John's, for 2 centuries, this handful of firms controlling this single fish was very nearly the entire visible economy of the place. By the later part of the 19th century, this single resource wealth had made Newfoundland something genuinely unusual, a self-governing dominion in its own right within the British Empire, complete with its own parliament, its own currency, its own postage stamps, and its own flag, a status shared by only a handful of places on Earth. Enter Sir William Whiteway, one of the colony's leading political figures through these decades, a premier who pushed hard to modernize Newfoundland, building a railway across the interior of the island, and trying to diversify an economy that remained, underneath its self-governing pride, almost completely dependent on the price of dried fish in foreign markets. That dependence was the flaw sitting quietly beneath the whole arrangement. A dominion could govern itself proudly on paper, while its entire treasury rose and fell on a single commodity it did not control the price of, and a country built that way is only ever as strong as the fishery that feeds it. Here is where it is worth pausing to correct something the popular version of this story tends to overstate. St. John's is routinely called, without qualification, the oldest city in North America, and the claim deserves a closer look rather than a simple repetition. The land itself, of course, had been inhabited for thousands of years before any European ship arrived, by indigenous peoples whose presence long predates any claim of founding. And even among European-founded settlements, St. John's does not stand entirely alone. Other cities on the continent, founded by other European powers around the same period or earlier, have their own strong claims to deep antiquity. What can be said accurately and with real confidence is narrower and, in its way, still remarkable. St. John's Harbor has one of the longest continuous records of use by English-speaking Europeans of any place in the Americas, and it holds a legitimate claim as one of the very oldest surviving European settlements on the continent. The city has never needed the exaggerated version of its own history. The true version is already extraordinary. If a story like this is why you're here, a like genuinely helps more people find it. Now, back to St. John's, and to the morning the harbor's wealth met its first great catastrophe. By the last decades of the 19th century, St. John's had grown crowded, prosperous, and dangerously flammable. Thousands of wooden buildings packed tight along narrow streets running up the hillsides above the harbor. Warehouses stuffed with tar, oil, and dried fish standing shoulder to shoulder with wooden homes and shops. On the 8th of July, 1892, in the middle of an unusually dry summer, a fire broke out in a stable on high ground above the town. It should have been a small, containable blaze. Instead, a stiff wind carried sparks across rooftops faster than anyone could fight them, and within hours, the fire had leapt from block to block through streets never designed to stop it. The heat grew so intense that it is said to have melted metal and driven flames from roof to roof ahead of any bucket line or hose. By the time it finally burned itself out, the fire had consumed the greater part of the city, roughly 2/3 of St. John's, reduced to smoking rubble in a single day. Thousands of families lost their homes in an afternoon, and the commercial heart of Water Street, the merchant houses and warehouses that had built the colony's fortune over 2 centuries, was gone. Contemporary accounts describe a wall of flame moving faster than people could carry their belongings out of its path, families abandoning homes with whatever they could grab in their arms, and columns of smoke visible from ships well out to sea. By nightfall, somewhere in the range of 10,000 to 12,000 people, out of a town of perhaps 30,000, found themselves without a roof over their heads, camped in churches, in the open fields at the edge of town, and in whatever public buildings had survived. The material loss ran into the millions of dollars in the currency of the day, an almost unimaginable sum for a small colonial economy, and it wiped out not just wooden homes, but the physical machinery of the fish trade itself, warehouses full of the current season's catch, the ledgers and records of firms that had operated for generations, the accumulated stock and capital of the entire merchant class in one afternoon. Relief poured in from Halifax, from Britain, and from across the fishing world that depended on this port, because everyone who traded through St. John's understood, instantly, what its loss would mean to the whole North Atlantic fish trade if it did not come back. And yet the city did not die. This is the part of the story that matters, because it sets up everything that comes after. St. John's had survived fires before, smaller ones, that had periodically swept through its crowded wooden streets, and each time the merchants and the ordinary families had simply rebuilt, because the reason the city existed, the harbor and the fishery beside it, had not burned at all. The same logic held in 1892. Within remarkably little time, new buildings rose on the ashes of the old, many of them now required by stricter building codes to be built in brick and stone rather than wood. The streets widened, where the old ones had been dangerously narrow. The rebuilt city that emerged in the years after the fire was, if anything, sturdier and more solid than the one the flames had taken. The harbor was untouched. The fishing grounds a few miles offshore were exactly as rich as they had been the day before. Whatever the fire could destroy, it could not touch the one thing the whole economy actually depended on. St. John's rebuilt because the ground beneath its wealth had never moved. But while the city was rebuilding its streets in brick, the century ahead was quietly preparing a second test, one the town's stone buildings would be powerless against, because this one would not come from a spark in a stable. It would come from the war that consumed a generation and from the slow economic exhaustion that followed it. The first blow came in a single terrible morning far from home. When the First World War called for volunteers, tiny Newfoundland, with a population smaller than many single cities on the mainland, raised its own regiment and sent it to the trenches of Europe, a disproportionate sacrifice for a country of its size. On the 1st of July, 1916, at a place called Beaumont Hamel, on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the Newfoundland Regiment advanced across open ground into machine gun fire and was almost annihilated in under half an hour. Of several hundred men who went forward that morning, the overwhelming majority were killed, wounded, or missing by the time it ended. For a small dominion, the loss was catastrophic in a way that a larger country could have absorbed, and Newfoundland simply could not. A wound to a single generation of young men that the whole small country felt directly and permanently. The economic reckoning came not long after, and it came from the same vulnerability that had always sat underneath the colony's pride. The worldwide collapse in commodity prices during the Great Depression hit a country whose entire treasury still rested on the price of dried fish, exactly as hard as it always would have, and Newfoundland's government, already carrying heavy debts from railway building and the costs of the war, found itself unable to pay its own bills. Faced with outright bankruptcy, the Dominion did something almost unthinkable for a self-governing country. In 1934, Newfoundland voluntarily surrendered its own parliament and its own self-government, handing control back to a British-appointed commission because it could no longer afford the basic apparatus of independence. A country that had once minted its own coins and flown its own flag as an equal member of the imperial family had been reduced, by economic exhaustion, to a ward of the empire that had once been proud to call it a partner. 15 years later, the question of what Newfoundland should become was finally put to its people directly. In 1948, in the aftermath of a Second World War that had brought new prosperity through military spending, but had not solved the deeper structural problem underneath the economy, Newfoundlanders voted in a referendum on their future, and the options included remaining under commission government, restoring full independence, or joining Canada altogether. Enter Joseph Smallwood, a passionate and relentless campaigner for confederation with Canada, who argued that only union with the mainland could give Newfoundlanders the social programs and economic security a small, fish-dependent dominion could never provide on its own. The vote was agonizingly close, decided by a margin of only a few percentage points, and it split families and communities down the middle in ways some would remember for the rest of their lives. On the last day of March 1949, Newfoundland formally joined Canada as its 10th province, and St. John's, the oldest English city on the continent, became the newest provincial capital in the Canadian Federation. Confederation brought real, tangible change. Federal money flowed in for roads, schools, and hospitals that the old colonial government could never have afforded, and it also brought a new, more industrial approach to the one resource the whole economy had always depended on. In the decades after joining Canada, the inshore fishery that families had worked from small boats for generations was increasingly supplemented and then overwhelmed by enormous offshore factory trawlers, Canadian and foreign vessels dragging nets across the ocean floor that could process and freeze catches on board at a scale the old dories and schooners could never have imagined. For a while, the numbers looked spectacular. Catches climbed to levels no one in the history of the fishery had ever seen, and it felt, for a stretch of years, like modern technology had simply made an old, inexhaustible resource even more productive than before. It had not. It had done the opposite. The staggering catches of the post-war decades were not evidence of an endless resource. They were evidence of a resource being consumed far faster than it could reproduce. Industrial trawlers, scraping breeding stock off the ocean floor, at a rate the cod population, however vast it had once seemed, could not possibly sustain. Scientists warned with increasing alarm that the numbers were unraveling. Quotas were argued over and often ignored or set too high by governments reluctant to tell entire coastal communities that their only livelihood was disappearing. And all the while, the fish that had built this city 5 centuries earlier, The fish John Cabot's crews had once hauled up in baskets grew scarcer with every passing season in exactly the waters that had once seemed too rich to ever run dry. We go inside another forgotten corner of Canada every week. If that's your kind of thing, subscribe and stay with us. Now, back to St. John's and to the second disaster, the one that would prove far harder to rebuild from than any fire. On the 2nd of July, 1992, the federal fisheries minister stood before the country and announced what science had been warning of for years and politics had spent just as long refusing to hear. Enter John Crosby, the federal minister responsible for fisheries and oceans, a Newfoundlander himself, who announced a complete moratorium on the northern cod fishery, effective immediately and for the foreseeable future. The stocks, it was now undeniable, had collapsed so completely that continuing to fish them risked driving the species toward commercial extinction in these waters altogether. Overnight, roughly 30,000 people across Newfoundland, fishing crews, plant workers, and the entire economy built around them, lost their livelihoods in a single announcement, the largest industrial layoff in Canadian history, delivered all at once to communities that in many cases had known no other way of life for 300 or 400 years. The announcement itself became one of the defining moments in the province's modern memory. Crosby faced furious crowds of fishermen in the weeks that followed, men who had spent their entire working lives on the water and now had nothing, shouting that the government had known the collapse was coming and had let the industrial trawlers keep fishing anyway, rather than face the political cost of admitting the truth sooner. There was no good answer to give them. The moratorium had been framed at first as a temporary pause, a couple of years at most, to let the stocks recover before the fishery could resume. Nobody in that room, least of all the minister making the announcement, expected it to still be substantially in effect more than 3 decades later. This is the hinge on which the whole 500-year story turns, and it is worth stating plainly because it is easy to miss the scale of it. The Great Fire of 1892 had destroyed buildings, and buildings can be rebuilt as long as the underlying reason for the city still exists. The cod moratorium of 1992 destroyed the underlying reason itself, the resource that had brought the first ships across the ocean, that had built the merchant fortunes on Water Street, that had funded a self-governing dominion, that Newfoundland had bankrupted and surrendered its independence, trying to protect, that had finally drawn the country into Confederation with Canada, simply was not there anymore, in the quantities that had ever mattered. There was nothing left to rebuild toward. The fire had taken the city's buildings and spared its purpose. The moratorium took the purpose itself and left the buildings standing empty of the only work that had ever filled them. The human cost radiated outward from St. John's into hundreds of small outport communities, up and down the coast, places that existed for no reason other than their nearness to the fishing grounds, and that now had no economic reason to exist at all. Many of those communities emptied out in the years that followed, their populations moving to St. John's itself, to the Canadian mainland, or abroad, in search of work that no longer existed at home. St. John's absorbed a great deal of that displacement, growing even as the wider outport economy around it hollowed out, becoming more completely than ever before the one place in the province where something resembling opportunity still concentrated. The city that had been built by the fish now had to learn, in a single generation, how to survive without it. What filled the gap, in the years that followed, was something that had been sitting unnoticed beneath the ocean floor the whole time. Enormous offshore oil deposits, discovered on the Grand Banks in the decades before the moratorium, moved from exploration to full production, just as the fishery that had defined the province for 5 centuries was disappearing, and the province found itself, almost by accident, sitting on a second fortune to replace the one it had exhausted. Platforms rose out in the same waters where the cod fleets had once worked, extracting a resource that, unlike the fish, would eventually run out on a schedule rather than an ecological collapse. but that for a generation brought real money and real jobs back into an economy that badly needed both. It was not the fishery. It was not what 500 years of the city's identity had been built on, but it kept St. John's alive through the hardest stretch of its modern history, and it remains, to this day, an uneasy, uncertain replacement for the resource that built the place in the first place. The shift showed up in the population figures more starkly than in almost anything else. As the outport fishery emptied, tens of thousands of Newfoundlanders left the province entirely in the years after the Moratorium, following work to Alberta's oil sands and to cities across the mainland, in a wave of departure so large that it changed the demographic shape of the province for a generation. Those who stayed increasingly concentrated in St. John's itself, drawn by the same logic that had drawn people to the harbor for 5 centuries, that this was still, whatever else had changed, the one place in Newfoundland where some kind of future seemed possible. The city that had once been the trading post for hundreds of small fishing communities up and down the coast became in effect the last one left standing, absorbing the people the outports could no longer support. So what does St. John's look like now, after the fire it survived and the collapse it could not rebuild from in the same way? Walk down toward the harbor today, and the streets that climb the hillsides are lined with narrow, brightly painted row houses in reds and blues and yellows, a look so distinctive that visitors and locals alike have given it an affectionate nickname, and the postcard image has become one of the most recognizable in the country, a cheerful, colorful face laid over a city with one of the harder histories in North America. The harbor itself is still there behind the Narrows, still one of the finest natural anchorages on the continent, though the schooners and the fish flakes that once covered its shores are long gone, replaced by pleasure boats, research vessels, and the support ships of an offshore oil industry that did not exist for most of the city's history. Water Street still runs along the waterfront, its rebuilt brick and stone facades from the 1890s, now protected as heritage buildings, monuments to a fire the city absorbed and moved past a full century before it faced the disaster it could not simply rebuild away. The cod moratorium itself has never fully been lifted. More than 3 decades after that announcement, the northern cod stocks have recovered only partially, a fraction of what they once were, and the industrial fishery that once defined this coast has never returned to anything like its old scale. The 30,000 jobs lost that summer did not come back, and the outport communities that emptied in the years afterward have, for the most part, stayed emptied. What St. John's inherited instead was the strange, permanent position of being the oldest city on the continent that had, within the span of a single century, survived losing nearly everything twice, once to fire in an afternoon, and once to the slow, grinding realization that the ocean beside it was not, after all, inexhaustible. So the story closes where it began, at the Narrows, at the gap in the cliffs, where ships have been sailing in and out for over 500 years. The harbor that made this the oldest English city on the continent is still exactly as sheltered, exactly as deep, and exactly as beautiful as it was when John Cabot's crews first reported a sea so full of fish that a basket lowered over the side came back up, brimming. The city built and rebuilt itself around that harbor, through fire, through war, through bankruptcy, and through the loss of its own independence, because as long as the fish were there was always a reason to come back and start again. What no one who built this place could have imagined is that the one disaster with no fire and no visible ruin, the quiet, gradual emptying of the water itself, would turn out to be the one the city has never fully recovered from. The Narrows are still there. The harbor is still full of ships. The fish that built it all is still, more than 3 decades later, mostly gone. And the city that outlasted the empire that founded it, the fire that nearly erased it, and the war that gutted a generation of its sons, goes on doing the one thing it has always done best. It endures, and it waits to see what the sea decides to give back. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who would appreciate it, and subscribe if you have not already. We have more of these lost fortunes and forgotten catastrophes waiting. The boom towns and the sin cities and the great cities history quietly tried to erase. We will see you inside the next one.